We're glad you're all with us, everyone. I'm Lori Ward. I am the fortunate individual to serve as CEO of Washington's National Park Fund. We raise and manage charitable gifts for Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. I often say in front of audiences, I believe I really do have the very best job in the world because it's such a privilege to work closely with park staff and scientists and volunteers and superintendents. We have a strong board of 22 individuals who are equally engaged and work hard, give their time, and just really involved in the organization. They help us. We have 7 staff members. They help us to make everything happen. There's 3 superintendents from the parks. They serve on our board as advisors. They attend our board meetings. We're very engaged with each other and very supportive of them. They give us, just so you know, they give us top priority projects at the beginning of the year, and we set out to raise money for those projects throughout the year. We average anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 million. Last year, you'll hear a little bit more about what we distributed to the 3 parks. Again, it's just a real privilege. So with that, I am ready to ask you, do you have your boots on, your hiking boots? Are you ready to board the virtual bus and travel with Jeff and me up to Mount Rainier National Park?
Yeah.
Let's go. With that, I welcome a friend to Washington's National Park Fund, Jeff Antonelis-Lapp. He has worked 2 summers up at Mount Rainier when he was just graduating from college. That ignited a connection to the mountain that he's had ever since. He began writing a book, Tahoma and the People, after being unable to find current historical natural history books about Mount Rainier. He saw it as an opportunity, and he was doing research, trying to pull things together as he planned to teach at the great Evergreen State College in Olympia. At Evergreen, he taught natural history, environmental education, and Native American studies until he retired, and he doesn't look old enough, in 2015. Jeff has summited the mountain. He's hiked all of its mapped trails, completed the 93-mile Wonderland Trail not once, but 5 times. He's conducted over 250 days of field work for the book that you're about to hear more about. Many of the fieldwork days were in the company of park archaeologists, biologists, and geologists. And with that, I want to turn it over to you, Jeff, and say welcome. And we're grateful that you're here. Thank you.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you, Lori. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. I hope you've got your lunch in your backpack with you because we're going to take a trip. Really looking forward to taking you on a virtual field trip to Mount Rainier National Park, one of our favorite mountains, right? All right. So I am Jeff Antonelis-Lapp, and I'm delighted to be with you. I want to first thank Lori and her staff for inviting me to lead the trip today and for making all the arrangements. So thanks very much. And I also want to mention quickly just a couple of my connections between Washington's National Park Fund and Mount Rainier National Park. One of the projects that the fund supports is the National Park Services Academy Science Interns. They help fund college students working as scientific interns at Mount Rainier National Park in the summertime. And their contact there at the park is the aquatics ecologist, Rebecca Lofgren. Well, it turns out Rebecca and I go back many years, and she and I coordinate an internship program that this summer has placed 4 Evergreen students up on the mountain in internships. And our interns between the National Park Service Science Academy and the Evergreen interns, they often work side by side. So I get to see folks on both sides of those internships. And I wouldn't be connected to these internships at all were it not for the hard work of a long-time board member of Washington's National Park Fund and a colleague of mine at Evergreen, Carolyn Dobbs. Carolyn was a very staunch advocate for public lands and did so much good work, started the internships for Evergreen at Mount Rainier many years ago, handed that over to me. And in fact, 10 years ago, Carolyn and another colleague and I, we taught a class at Evergreen on Mount Rainier. And the highlight was taking 55 students up to the mountain for a 10-day field trip. 55 students, 10 days. That's a lot of spaghetti. All right. And we had every kind of weather imaginable. We got poured, dumped, frozen multiple times. And when you ask students for their reactions to the trip when we got back to campus, to a person, they said, the trip, it was epic. So apparently they had a good time and they learned a lot. So let's get on the bus. Let's get going here. And as you get on the bus, I want you to notice my license plate on my car. And if you don't know about the National Parks plates in Washington State, make sure that you connect with Lori and get the story from her about those. Help raise funds for Washington's National Park Fund. So as you may have gathered, I'm going to talk with you a little bit today about my natural history of Mount Rainier National Park, called Tahoma and Its People. It was published this spring by Washington State University Press. And so as we're on the bus up to the mountain, I'm going to talk with you for a little bit about some of those things in there. And as you might know, Tahoma was one of several Native American terms for Mount Rainier. And if you'd like to know more about it, just put that as a question in the question and answer box, and I'll get to that at the end of the talk. But there are a couple groups of people that I want to single out and recognize that were really important to me and to my research. Even many years before I started working on Tahoma, folks on the reservations at Muckleshoot, Nisqually, and others in Western Washington invited me onto their tribal lands. Now, it's kind of funny, I was there to teach, but actually I think I learned more than I ever taught. And because of their kindness, I was able to study the Fulshutseed language. This is a southern dialect of Lushootseed, which is one of the original tongues of Puget Sound country. Eh, chuff, siaya. Eh, chuff, siaya. Hello, friend. And folks there on these reservations also taught me how to harvest and process red cedar bark. They taught me a little bit of weaving. And these gifts enabled me and prepared me to learn about and to write about the presence of their ancestors at Tahoma over the ages. The other group of folks, no surprise, is with the National Park Service. And they opened up their research lives and shared so much time with me. And because of them, I was able to climb onto glaciers and help take measurements. They drug me up into alpine lakes that don't even have names, don't even have trails, and taught me how to survey for amphibians. I learned how to search for stone tool artifacts. These and a whole host of other projects added so much to my research over the years. Now, their standard trick, I see some Park Service people are here, and so you do this trick too, I'm sure. We would get at the trailhead in the morning ready to take off, and they would say, oh, hey, Jeff, by the way, can you carry this? And they would invariably give me a heavy piece of equipment to schlep around all day. So there's so many things potentially to talk about in a natural history, so many subjects. And I know that when you read Tahoma, you'll probably connect with many of the stories. But I think for this talk and this field trip, our best bet is to narrow it down to what I think are the two big stories in Tahoma. One is that people have been going to the mountain for generations, for eons, over 9,000 years. And the second big story is that climate change, the effects at Mount Rainier are pretty far reaching. So let's dig into these. I've got plenty to say about each, and let's start with the people going up to the mountain. Let's begin with Lieutenant Couts, an Army officer stationed at Fort Steilacoom, about 60 miles away from Mount Rainier. And like many of us in this webinar, he became mesmerized by Mount Rainier. He became obsessed with climbing it. And one of the interesting things about European American explorers in the West back in the day was that many of them held an idea, largely a mistaken idea, that Native people avoided the high country. And this, in fact, is reflected in one of Couts's journal entries as he was preparing to climb the mountain. He wrote that information relating to the mountain was exceedingly meager. No white man had ever been near it, and Indians were superstitious and afraid of it. Superstitious and afraid. And ironically, Couts was helped to a large degree by Indian people. Leschi, the noted Nisqually leader, suggested to Couts that he take a route up the Nisqually River Valley, and it was probably Leschi who also suggested that he hire Wapaweddy to guide his expedition. Wapaweddy and Leschi hailed from the same Nisqually village. So another example of this mistaken belief of Native people avoiding the high country comes from Hazard Stevens. And with his climbing partner, P.B. Van Trump, these two are generally credited by most historians with the first successful ascent of Mount Rainier. Stevens had the same ideas. He wrote of Mount Rainier that it was a virgin peak. The superstitious fears and traditions of the Indians had prevented their attempting to reach the summit. Now, this idea was pervasive and it lasted for many, many years, but it started to be turned on its head in the 20th century. There was an anthropologist from Washington State University, Alan Smith. In 1963, he arranged to interview tribal elders at Yakima, Muckleshoot, and Nisqually. And what he learned from those elders brought forward a body of knowledge that was not widely known at that time at all. The elders told him of trips up into the high country over generations, them, their families, their ancestors, and Smith learned that people went up there mostly in search of resources that they did not have access to near their lowland villages. For example, Smith learned that people highly prized mountain goats because of the warm wool, their thick hides. These made great blankets and good robes. He also learned that people collected bear grass. Now, this is a member of the lily family. Notice those long, slender basal leaves? People collected those and then used them as imbrication, part of the design pattern in basket making. Smith also learned from the elders that one of the resources most sought after by Native people was huckleberries. Yeah, huckleberries. Now, it doesn't matter if you call them huckleberries or blueberries, but the several species of vaccinium found in the high country were an extremely important part of Native American diets. And of course, people ate them fresh, but they also preserved them for later use. So after picking them, they might build a small smoldering fire and erect a rack over the top of it, maybe put a mat on that, and then put the berries on the mat to dry. And then they would take them back to their villages and reconstitute them, rehydrate them, and use them over the winter months. Turns out huckleberries are a very important source of vitamin C in early Native American diets. Well, Smith also learned from the elders that they laid loose claim to certain parts of the mountain, basically along ridge lines, as indicated by these thick gray lines here on this map. And I want you to notice that people accessed and used areas of the mountain based on the watersheds within which they lived. They kind of stuck to their boundaries, if you will. Now, no doubt there were other tribal groups that used the mountain, but these were the 5 that really came forward in Smith's interviews. And this is a map that shows the early population centers, some of the largest villages of Puyallup, Nisqually, and Muckleshoot, about the time of settlement in the mid-19th century in the Puget Sound area. And I want you to notice the scale at the bottom. Even the villages closest to the mountain are more than 30 miles away. And notice Yakima villages over 80 miles away from the mountain. And keep in mind, travel by horseback is a relatively recent occurrence in this region, only the last few hundred years. So for centuries, people were on foot to get to the mountain. We think maybe 20 miles a day or more, in some cases for several days. And I think this shows pretty conclusively that there was a very strong attraction of the mountain to people. And in this case, in many of these cases, it was to access resources that they didn't otherwise have. Well, Smith turned his interview notes over to his colleague that summer, 1963, to Richard Daugherty. Daugherty was an archaeologist, and with a group of graduate students, that fall, he set out on foot to try to find some archaeological sites based on the interview notes. And acting on a park ranger's tip, they found a rock shelter on the northeast side of the mountain. Now, if you look here on this rock face, bottom right-hand corner quadrant, you notice kind of a concave area? That's the rock shelter. So I want you to come with me and check this out. What they found here was a hunter's camp used for over 1,000 years by Yakima and probably Klickitat people. So people came here and set up camp, built fires, roasted their game, slept here, worked on their tools, maintained their tools, used it as a base camp. The next year, the site was excavated and researchers found over 100 stone tool artifacts. Now, these are scrapers, blades, and a projectile point that are representative of some of the finds found at Mount Rainier's archaeological sites. Here's a close-up of a projectile point. And I have to tell you, from working at several sites, these are very unusual. Most of what you find are tiny little slivers of rock, not much bigger than your pinky fingernail. All right. But this was a huge find, the Frying Pan Creek Rock Shelter. This was the highest site in Washington at the time. It was the first at Mount Rainier. It was a big deal to archaeologists, to researchers. There were more to be added to the record soon, and I want to take you to a couple of those sites. So come with me back on the bus. We're going to drive around to the Couts Creek picnic area. And actually, this site is on the way up to Indian Henry's hunting ground. And if you've ever hiked up the Couts Creek Trail from the picnic area at Couts Creek, you've been not too far away from this site, which was, so far as we can tell, probably used by Nisqually people. It's in the Nisqually watershed. Probably used for over 7,000 years based on the artifacts found there. So people would come here, set up camp, and again, gather, hunt, collect the resources that I've been talking about. I want to point out the expert, then park archaeologist Greg Burchard. He's actually in a unit, and from all appearances is the only one who really seems to be doing any work here, right? And the rest of, or most of the rest of us, including yours truly, what are we doing? The standard pose, hands on hips, right? Greg was so important to the development of the park's archaeological record. He's now retired. He added dozens of sites to the record, and he created models that helped explain where did people go on the mountain, when, that even today guide some of the archaeological projects at Mount Rainier. Now, I want to drag you back to the other side of the mountain and show you one of my favorite sites. This is near Sunrise, and this was what was probably, you can imagine it like a campground. These were students who were participating in a field camp that was operated by Central Washington University for a number of years. And based on the type of tools and the wide range of tools found here, experts have concluded that family groups, so men and women, their children, probably extended family, probably from Yakima villages and probably from Muckleshoot villages on the White and Green Rivers, probably came up here, again, in summer after the snows had melted back, set up camp, and did their business of collecting resources. Now, here's a couple of students that are actually excavating a fire hearth. And these things are like treasure chests. A fire hearth has so much information for a researcher. Here's the finished excavation. The fire pit itself is in the bottom right corner here. And of course, you would expect them to find fire charred rock and bits of charcoal, right? Sure. But how about bone, teeth, tooth enamel that later are found to have belonged to mountain goat, marmots? How about gizzard stones that belong to sooty grouse, a game bird that people roasted and ate? How about vegetative material like huckleberry nuts, or huckleberry seeds rather, white bark pine nuts or hazelnuts? All of these things are clues to the people that came here. And I have sat around this hearth with other people, and to have that feeling of what must have it been like over thousands of years to sit around a crackling fire. I've been there, of course, in broad daylight. What would that have been like? Really interesting to think about. So as we wrap up this part of the talk, the big story about people in Mount Rainier, this map shows many of the over 100 archaeological sites at Mount Rainier. So some dots represent an isolated find, like a projectile point, or a chipstone tooling debris, the scatter of the chipstone tooling, or some of the sites that I've shown you. But all of them are so important, such a valuable part as we learn more about the legacy of Native Americans at Mount Rainier. And I think of these sites as having such value, like beads on a strand that represent currency for trading. And as we add more sites and add more information, we increase the value of what we know about Native people at Mount Rainier. And I think of this as almost like a necklace of beautiful beads encircling Tahoma. So let's get on to the other big story. And this is about the effects of climate change at Mount Rainier. And I can tell you that just being out with the researchers, I get an earful. Out at Natchez Peak, one of the first things that the butterfly surveyors told me was that their data indicates subalpine and alpine butterflies appear to be quite affected by a warming climate. Looking for bull trout on the upper reaches of the White River and its tributaries, I learned that these organisms have a very narrow band of habitat suitability. They like really, really, really cold water. And this is going to put them at greater risk probably as water temperatures continue to rise in this century. At Upper Palisades Lake, surveying for Northwestern salamanders and long-toed salamanders, I learned that the park's 14 species of amphibians, all of them appear to be at risk in the face of climate change. And at Paradise, researchers from the University of Washington are finding that wildflowers are opening earlier and staying open for longer periods of time than in prior years. And this isn't necessarily good news when you consider the tight phenology, the sequencing, the patterning between the plants and their pollinators. This could cause some long-term effects that we don't even know about yet. So what of the glaciers? Well, of course, you and I know these as the giant cloaks of ice and snow that gird the mountain, right? More of that here than any other mountain in the contiguous United States. More ice and snow at Tahoma than all the Cascade Mountains combined. And so I'm going to show you a couple of photographs of the Nisqually Glacier that will start to give you an impression of the status of the glaciers. Use this star as your point of reference. And I want you to notice the glacial cover from side to side and coming down the glacier toward you. And now I'm going to show you a photograph taken from the exact same location a little over 100 years later. Are you ready? Here we go. Here it is. So one more time, from here to here. What do you think? Pretty dramatic, don't you say? Yeah, pretty dramatic. What do the experts say? Well, Scott Beeson is the park geologist, and his recent studies found that the mountain's glaciers lost 39% of their area and 45% of their volume between 1896 and 2015. So in other words, in 120 years, the park's glaciers lost over a third of their coverage, their area, and nearly 1/2 of their thickness, their volume. And Scott's colleague, recently retired Paul Kennard, at a workshop not too long ago, I heard Paul say that we've lost 8 glaciers at Mount Rainier in my lifetime. And all of the glaciers at Mount Rainier are at their historic minimums, the furthest up the mountainside since record keeping began over 100 years ago. So there's more to the story about climate change and the effects on the mountain. And for that, we're going to take a look at a couple of the rivers that flow away from it. Here's a shot of the Carbon looking downstream near the park entrance. And I want you to imagine that you are standing on this or right near this triangular sandbar in the foreground. Sandy. Notice also the gravel and the cobbles here and elsewhere in the riverbed. And keep in mind that much of this material has moved down to this spot from higher up on the mountain, and it's on its way eventually into the Puyallup River and then into Puget Sound. This is a normal process where sediment accumulates in riverbeds. This happens on glaciated rivers where they're carrying sediment. It's called aggradation. And throughout most of the 20th century, it was pretty average, pretty normal at Mount Rainier, about 4 inches per decade. And then Beeson and his colleagues made a startling discovery. They found that in a 10-year period, that had increased by a factor of 9, 36 inches in a 10-year period. Wow! Why the big change? Well, when you consider that glacial ice and snow on the upper mountain is kind of like the glue that holds together glacial moraines and other rock material, as that breaks up, that ice and snow deteriorates, more and more rock material and sediment is going to be available for downslope movement. And when it does that, it's going to fill these riverbeds. And when you have a high water event, what's going to happen? Well, the water's got to find a place to go. It's going to widen the riverbed. It's going to erode. It's going to overtop the banks. And a classic example of this, extreme, was the flood in 2006. So now you and I have traveled to the Nisqually entrance. The park in that flooding event picked up about 18 inches of rain in a 36-hour period. And while we're here, I'd like you to look around and see if you can find the Sunshine Point campground and picnic area. Actually, most of it floated down the Nisqually River. Yeah, it took crews over 6 months to repair over $20 million worth of damage. Now, another effect of this great quantities of rock material being loose and available for downslope movement is that this can rush down river valleys in the form of debris flows, or a slightly more technical term called a glacial outburst flood. And these are happening with increasing frequency. They come tearing down a river valley. And since the 1960s, we've seen over 30 of them at Mount Rainier. And what I want you to do now is come with me up the West Side Road a bit, and we take a look at Tahoma Creek. Once upon a time, a skinny little mild-mannered little creek that has now become a raging, widened torrent. Look how braided it is, all the rock material. You can see the trees that have been battered by debris flows, standing dead trees in the background that have been smothered, their roots have been smothered or suffocated or drowned. So these events, increases in aggradation, in flooding events, higher incidence of debris flows and glacial outburst floods, all of these are in addition to the fact that Mount Rainier is already an active volcano with its own set of pre-existing geologic hazards. Yikes! Can I get a yikes? Yeah. So when we look at the geologic record of the mountain, we see that over the last 10,000 years, about 55 events or more known as Lahars have come tearing down Mount Rainier slopes. And this is from an Indonesian word that means like 1,000 stampeding water buffalo. So that should give you a sense of the power and the noise that these things generate. They can come flying down a river valley, 40 miles an hour or faster, like a slurry of wet cement, and they can just engulf everything in their path. So I've got a little clip I want to show you of a Lahar, and this will give in Indonesia, by the way, and this will give you a sense of the power of these things and what they're capable of doing. So check this out. Whew, what do you think? Kind of impressive, huh? And did you hear the people hooting and whistling and hollering in the background? They were probably telling the videographer, hey, get the heck out of the way, man. So anyway, here's a map that shows the past and potential paths of Lahars flowing down the river valleys away from Mount Rainier. And one of the largest on record anywhere, the Osceola mud flow, you're going to see it in a moment, comes screaming down the White River Valley, tearing across the Enumclaw Plateau. So here it comes. Part of it went into Tacoma's Commencement Bay. Part of it went through present-day Auburn and Kent, filled in part of Puget Sound. Nearly a cubic mile of Lahar debris from the Osceola mud flow. In fact, our home in Enumclaw sits on probably 50 or 60 feet of the Osceola mud flow. Now, in more recent times, the electron mud flow came ripping down the Puyallup River Valley down the northwest side of the mountain. So put your eyes on that. And here comes the electron mud flow through present-day Ording, running out into the Puyallup area. Okay, it was powerful enough to float boulders like this. This is about 14 feet across, sitting in a neighborhood in Ording. And the electron mud flow came through present-day Ording and buried it under about a 16-foot mantle of Lahar debris. So with this talk of geologic hazards and active volcanoes and the recent commemoration of Mount St. Helens' 40th eruption, 40 years ago, you might be thinking to yourself, yikes, and what are the chances that something like this could happen to Mount Rainier? Well, hey, here's the good news. Both stratovolcanoes, Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens, both composite volcanoes, first cousins, right? But different magmatic properties, different geologic hazards. As I mentioned, Mount Rainier's hazards are different, not prone to violent explosive eruptions, so probably will not erupt like this. But still, as we start to wrap up our field trip, you've got to think about this attraction of people to the mountain for thousands of years, to a mountain that frankly is one of the most dangerous mountains, most dangerous volcanoes in North America. What's going to happen? Well, sometimes I think of Mount Rainier as like a giant ice cream cone that's melting on a really hot summer day. And that's causing all sorts of questions, all sorts of challenges for researchers. And questions like, how many glaciers will we lose? What plants and animals will be most affected? What will future generations encounter when they go to visit Mount Rainier? Well, for me, those are pretty big questions, pretty problematic. But the good news, I believe, is that the connection between Tahoma and its people is today as strong as ever, beginning with the native people who went up to the mountain thousands of years ago to today's folks on a beautiful summer day up at Paradise. Now, granted, this summer, a lot of folks will be wearing masks and probably practicing some social distancing. But even still, in recent years, the park has drawn over 2 million visitors per year. Phew! And what do they do up there? Well, they do a lot of things. They backpack, bicycle, birdwatch, bivouac, botanize, camp, climb, draw, drive, geocache, hike, stroll, mountaineer, stargaze, photograph, sightsee, paint, ski, snowboard, skinny dip. I told you, they do a lot of things. And they do lots of other things too. Folks that live in the Puyallup River Valley, in the communities of Ording, Puyallup and Sumner, prepare for Lahar possibilities by participating in Lahar evacuation drills. These students in Puyallup have about 1 hour to gain 30 feet in elevation off of the valley floor. Up on the mountain, hundreds of people every year are dedicating thousands and thousands of hours to all sorts of projects. And this is a great way to get ownership, to feel like a steward of your national park, to deepen your relationship with the mountain. No matter what your abilities are, no matter what your interests might be, or your age. These are good stories. And let's close with a few more good stories. Here's Ben Diaz in the background, now park archaeologist at a site. And Ben continues to work with native tribes and oversee projects every summer. So we continue to learn about the legacy of Native Americans at Mount Rainier and their connections there. This story began over 100 years ago. When the engineers built the Carbon River Road, they didn't realize that building the road on the floodplain was a bad idea. And ends up, Carbon River Road, nothing but a whole lifetime of erosion, flooding, washouts. And even in the 1930s, the hardworking young men of the Civilian Conservation Corps did their best over 7 years trying to build erosion control devices to control the path of the carbon. No such luck. But these days, we're very fortunate to have engineered log jams that can be installed so these log structures can actually change the course of a river. When they slow it down, it drops its sediment load and actually can change the course of a river and protect roads or other structures that are endangered. Another cool thing about engineered log jams is that they provide habitat for migrating salmon. So a slower place in the river where fish can hide out, rest, feed, good stuff. And a combination of all these features is in a new type of structure called setback levees. This is the Calistoga Setback Levee in Ording. This is an award-winning project. It runs along the Puyallup River, and you notice how far back the levee is set from the river, so when it floods, when the river exceeds its banks, it won't wipe out roads. It won't take out people's property. It floods that riparian area, which, as it turns out, is great news for off-channel habitat and migrating salmon. So let's close with just a couple of more good news stories. This is an amazing partnership between the Washington Department of Corrections and the Evergreen State College. It's called Sustainability in Prisons Project, and incarcerated people like these folks here have an opportunity to develop a relationship with nature and do good work on behalf of Mount Rainier. In fact, while they're incarcerated, these people raise native plants that are then planted out at Mount Rainier and the watersheds around the mountain. Pretty cool. Other incarcerated people have raised over 18,000 larvae and Taylor's checker spot butterflies. You might know that Taylor's checker spot is protected under the Endangered Species Act. And when raised, these butterflies and the larvae are put out into the Nisqually Prairie in the watershed around Mount Rainier. When I visited the butterfly rearing facility, some of the incarcerated people there were working, and one of them said to me, she said, you know, it makes me feel so good to work here. We're saving their lives and they're changing ours. Then she looked at me and she said, it makes me feel like the best is yet to come for them and for us. Pretty powerful. One last story about this furry little critter. You might be familiar with the fisher, a member of the weasel family. They were extirpated by trappers from Washington's forests in the early 20th century, and now they're making a comeback. They're being live trapped from a large population in Canada, and they're being released into the Olympics and into the Cascades. And I'm going to close with a sequence of photographs from a fisher release party at Longmire. And the cool thing here is the biologists asked the kids to come forward and help release the fishers. So there's one inside this plywood carton. That is a park wildlife ecologist, Tara Chestnut, on her knees there, helping the kids get ready. She's an Evergreen alum, I should probably add. And now the door is up and the fisher is just about to spring, and there it goes and goes and goes into its new life in the forest at Mount Rainier. Isn't that great? Yeah. Well, hey, I want to thank you for your attention and your interest. We're bringing the bus back into the parking lot here, wrapping up our virtual field trip. But in case you'd like to get a copy of Tahoma and its people, there are ways for you to do that. Also, I'd love to hear from you. If you want to contact me for other events or any other reason, here's how to do that. And in just a moment, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll kick into the question and answer period, which I'm really looking forward to. Thanks again for your good attention.
Well, if your writing style in Tahoma and its people is anything like the way you present today, and I'm certain that it is, it will be a pleasure reading it. I look forward to it, Jeff.
Great.
A few things I want to mention that you said, like beads on a strand. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. And could you reel off once again, do you have that memorized, all the things that people do at Mount? That was
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. So yes, I have it memorized. Now that you put me on the spot, I'll probably flub a dub. What do they do there? Well, they backpack, bicycle, bird watch, bivouac, botanize, camp, climb, draw, drive, geocache, hike, stroll, mountaineer, stargaze, photograph, sightsee, paint ski, snowboard, skinny dip.
Oh, that's so great. That's just so great. I love it. Okay, a few quick questions for you. Are you familiar with the plates, that the round metal plates that appear outside of the Paradise Visitor Center? Can
Yeah.
you mention a little, because a lot of people don't know about that, and do you know, or should I try to explain it?
You can if you want. I know a little bit about them. You're talking about the little markers that basically represent the mountains in the Cascade Range.
And they're
Right.
all volcanic, and they go
Yeah.
all the way
Yeah.
from the border of Canada, and they're positioned in the same way that they are right down through California.
Yeah.
So I just encourage people, when you're up there, look at those and take a moment. They're
Absolutely.
embedded into the cement, and that's
Yeah.
quite.
Absolutely. And folks, that's your next homework assignment. I'm a teacher. I can't help it. Next time you're up at Paradise, you have to find these things. They're easy just to walk by and miss them altogether. But when you see one, then you can see they're part of the chain. The Cascade Range is represented in Paradise with these markers. It's really cool. So make sure you check it out, and with your families too. Kids will probably get a kick out of it too.
It really is neat. Quick question from Julia. Where can we find early maps of trails that first peoples used?
Whew. Well, wow. So I can say a little bit about that. And if this is a shameless plug for the book, but anyway, one of the things that I did was I met the fellow who has reconstructed the 82-mile trail from Yakima villages all the way up to Mount Rainier. And we spent 4 days tracing the trail that he had found. Some of it is underwater now, some of it has disappeared, but in the book there is a map of that original trail, and you could trace some of that out. That group is called the William O. Douglas Heritage Foundation. They've created the trail named after William O. Douglas. That's the most accessible one that I can think of. Otherwise, just know that when you and I are walking on trails, many cases we are in the footsteps of the ancients, and many of our roadways have originated as a result of game trails, then used by people, then wagon roads. And so these things have gone through an evolution that, you know, has just been through time, has been really impressive. If anybody finds more about Indian trails, shoot me an email. I'd love to know more.
That's great. Quick question from a former ranger and good friend of Washington's National Park Fund. What was your favorite day in the park as you've pulled all this together, Jeff?
Well, a lot of favorite days, but the one that just about knocked me over was with the Spotted Owl survey crew. And Keith Bagnall, Park Seasonal, was very gracious to let me come out with the crew. They're all fit and young and super energetic, and they're dragging me through the woods off trail. And we finally find a couple of spotted owls that are young that we're going to band and then release. And so when we're done measuring them and weighing them and they've got the bands on, they turn to me and they say, "Hey, do you want to set one free?" And so they handed me a northern spotted owl, and I'm a bird watcher, and so this was kind of like getting tickets to the Super Bowl, right? And this was a big deal. I'm holding this northern spotted owl, and its eyes just penetrated mine. I can't describe it. That thing just looked at me, and and then I heard someone say, "Just let her go, Jeff. Let her go." And I'm like, I'm just paralyzed. "Let her go, Jeff." And finally I get the message, and I just release it, and it flies off into a tree. That was probably one of the highlights.
That's wonderful. Jeff, we have a lot of fun comments. We'll make sure that you receive them. A lot of your friends and supporters are chiming in here. I want to begin to close. I want to tell people that this is, I think, our 12th or 13th virtual field trip. We've been doing them weekly, and coming in July, we're going to start our summer series and go every other week, because we anticipate folks will be up and out in the fresh air. One of the programs that we have done features the fishers over at Olympic, and it's fascinating. All of these programs are recorded and they appear on our website. So go to the site, check them out. The one on the fishers is, I wish I had time to tell you a little bit more, but you just need to go there, folks, and watch that one. It's a beautiful story. Let's see, there's information. This is some of our mission and the 4 core areas that we support. We are grateful really for people like Jeff who come on and share their knowledge and their passion for Mount Rainier. I know that a lot of the folks who are with us here today are big park fans, and especially Mount Rainier. Write to us if you have specific questions. There's our website right there, folks. Jeff, any closing comments?
Just thank you again for including me and giving me the opportunity. I'm frantically trying to answer folks' questions that are in the chat. They ask me direct questions, so I'm doing the best I can even after we close. If you could just, if it's possible for me just to finish going through those. But again, I would just say thanks to everybody for coming on the trip. Great fun. And please be safe out there. And in the meantime, keep your spirits high and your boots dry.
And Sharon London, our Director of Philanthropy, thank you for all the work that you do on these every week, and we're just so grateful to you. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Jeff.
So long.
Bye-bye.